From Trump threatening Canada,
We don't need cars from Canada. We don't need energy from Canada. We don't need anything from Canada.
to Carney, surprising the world with a retaliation nobody saw coming.
Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian.
This is exactly what Trump did not expect from Canada. The moment everything changed. To understand how we got here, you need to go back to the moment Trump thought he had already won. For months, he had been hammering Canada with tariffs, threatening to make it the 51st state, and publicly dismissing the entire Canadian economy like it was an afterthought. His strategy was simple and brutal. Apply enough economic pressure until Canada's government collapsed politically, and whoever replaced them came crawling to Washington, ready to accept whatever deal Trump put on the table. It almost worked. Justin Trudeau's government was already crumbling under the weight of Trump's pressure when he resigned and handed leadership to Mark Carney in early 2025. Trump looked at that transition and saw exactly what he wanted to see: a weakened country installing a replacement leader who would be desperate to stabilize the relationship and willing to make major concessions to do it. What Trump completely miscalculated was who Mark Carney actually is. This is not a career politician who rose through the system, making promises and shaking hands. This is the man who steered Canada's economy through the 2008 global financial crisis, and then crossed the Atlantic to run the Bank of England through the chaos of Brexit. He has sat across the table from the most powerful financial institutions in the world and negotiated under pressure that would break most people. When Trump tried to intimidate him in the Oval Office by suggesting Canada should become the 51st state, Carney did not flinch. He looked at the President of the United States and used a real estate analogy on a man famous for real estate, telling him that some properties are simply never for sale. The room went quiet. Trump could only respond with "never say never." That moment told the whole world something important. Canada had found its footing and Trump had not expected it. The secret weapon Washington ignored.
Canada is forging a new strategic partnership with China.
Here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because while the cameras were focused on the diplomatic theater of that Oval Office meeting, something much more significant was already happening behind the scenes. Canada had quietly started making trade deals with other countries. In January 2026, Ottawa concluded a preliminary trade agreement with Beijing that nobody in Washington had seen coming. Canada allowed Chinese electric vehicles into the market at dramatically reduced tariff rates, and in return, China slashed duties on Canadian agricultural exports, including canola oil, one of Canada's most important crops. For Canadian farmers who had been bleeding money since the trade war began, it was a lifeline. For Trump, it was a direct challenge to his entire strategy of isolating Canada economically until it surrendered.
Now, Canada and China have struck a deal that will slash tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and Canadian farm products. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and China's Xi Jinping announced the preliminary agreement after talks in Beijing.
Trump's reaction told you everything about how rattled Washington actually was. He immediately threatened 100% tariffs on Canadian exports if Canada became what he called a drop-off port for Chinese goods flowing into the United States. Then in the same week, his own Treasury Secretary said that if Canada could get a deal with China, that was actually a good thing for Carney to do. The contradictions inside Trump's own team revealed something important. They had not prepared for Canada to actually go out and find alternative markets. The whole pressure campaign was built on the assumption that Canada had nowhere else to go. That assumption turned out to be completely wrong. The numbers that should terrify Washington. Now, let's talk about why Canada's position is stronger than Trump's public statements suggest, because the economic reality of this situation is something the White House has been very careful not to discuss openly. Canada supplies 26% of every barrel of oil the United States imports every single day. The refineries in Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin were specifically built and engineered to process Canadian crude and cannot simply switch to another source overnight. If the trade relationship breaks down badly enough to disrupt those oil flows, gasoline prices in Trump's most important electoral states spike within days, not weeks, days. That is a direct political cost that hits Trump voters at the pump every single time they fill up their tank, and there is no executive order that fixes it quickly. Then there are the auto plants. Canadian and American manufacturing are so deeply connected that a single car crosses the border multiple times in parts before it becomes a finished vehicle. Ford's Michigan plants, GM's Ohio facilities, and Stellantis operations throughout the region all depend on Canadian supply chains running normally every single day. When Canadian factories slow down, American factories slow down with them because they are feeding each other components that neither side can quickly source elsewhere. Even the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which represents American business interests above everything else, publicly warned that ending USMCA would immediately damage American agriculture, manufacturing, and energy infrastructure in ways no quick policy fix can address. And the U.S. Trade Representative himself admitted publicly that negotiating with Canada has been more challenging than negotiating with Mexico. That is not the language of someone who holds all the power in the room. That is the language of a negotiator who knows the other side has real cards to play.
Stop invoking rules-based international order as though it still functions as advertised. Call it what it is: a system of intensifying great power rivalry where the most powerful pursue their interests using economic integration.
Carney's bigger plan. Carney, at the podium in Davos in January 2026, calling on middle power countries to work together and resist economic coercion by dominant world powers. Use the portion where he warns that countries on their own will end up on the menu. Available on the World Economic Forum official YouTube channel and CBC News. But here is the part of this story that reveals just how far ahead of Trump's expectations Canada has actually moved. Carney is not just playing defense. He is rebuilding Canada's entire economic architecture from the ground up while the trade war is still happening. At Davos in January 2026, he stood in front of the global financial community and called on middle power countries to work together and build economic relationships that reduce their dependence on any single dominant partner. He was talking about the United States without naming it directly, and every person in that room understood exactly what he meant. He has since been to India, South Korea, and Mexico building relationships and exploring agreements that give Canada real alternatives to American markets. His stated goal is to double Canada's non-US exports within a decade. In December 2025, Canadian exports to non-US countries hit a record high, jumping 30% compared to the same month the previous year. The strategy is working faster than even its supporters expected. Canada is not sitting around waiting for Trump to offer better terms. It is actively building a world where those terms matter a little less every single month. The July deadline and what comes next. All of this comes down to one date that is now less than 5 months away. July 1st, 2026, when the mandatory USMCA review forces all three countries into a formal process to either extend the agreement or begin watching it slowly fall apart. Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc has already warned publicly that if no consensus is reached during the review, the agreement enters a cycle of annual reviews that creates permanent uncertainty and forces businesses on both sides of the border to make investment decisions without knowing what the rules will be next year.
We're seized with the impact these tariffs are having on our industries. We're taking the time necessary to secure what, in our judgment, might be a good deal for the Canadian economy.
He flew to Mexico to stand alongside his Mexican counterpart and deliver a united message that both countries are committed to keeping a three-party agreement alive, deliberately denying Washington the ability to isolate and pressure them separately. Trump came into this trade war expecting Canada to be the easy one, the country that would fold first, accept the worst terms, and set the precedent for how America deals with its neighbors going forward. Instead, he found a country that fired back with its own tariffs, elected a prime minister specifically because of his willingness to stand up to Washington, quietly signed a trade deal with China, and started building an entirely new economic strategy that does not put the United States at the center of everything. The leverage Canada brought to this fight was always there. The oil, the critical minerals, the auto supply chains, the agricultural exports. Washington just never expected Canada to actually use them. And it certainly never expected a prime minister confident enough to walk into the Oval Office and tell the most powerful man in the world that some things are simply not for sale. Trump called Canada dependent. He said America does not need Canadian products. He tried to use economic pressure to break a country that had been America's closest partner for generations. What he got instead was a prime minister who told him some things are never for sale. A surprise trade deal with China, record-breaking export numbers to non-American markets, and a Canada that is more economically independent today than it was when this trade war started. The July deadline is coming. The negotiating table is being set. And for the first time in this entire confrontation, Washington is the side that looks like it did not see any of this coming. Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe because this story is far from over.